Tonight, you drift into the quiet echoes of castles and candlelight, where forgotten knights once walked in silence, leaving only legends behind. The night begins softly, as it should, with the kind of quiet that clings to stone walls long after the torches are blown out. You can almost hear the hush of the medieval countryside. Owls sighing from hollow trees, a distant stream whispering its silver tune, and the faint rustle of hay in a farmer's cart that trundled by hours ago. A single candle flickers beside you, and the shadows stretch long and thin across the floor, as though they too are weary of holding themselves upright. Welcome, traveler. Though, let's be honest, you probably won't make it through this day awake. That's fine. Falling asleep during the middle of a medieval knight's tale is not a crime. If anything, it's the most authentic way to experience it, because these legends were often told beside a fire, half-whispered, half-dreamed, until sleep claimed the listeners. Before we sink too deep into armor, honor, and the faint smell of horse manure, let me gently remind you, if you find yourself enjoying this quiet stroll through time, do consider liking the video and subscribing. Your support keeps the stories alive. And, if you're feeling kind, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I promise knights will not ride into your village if you don't. But still, I'd love to know. Now, let's ease into tonight's journey. You stand on the worn cobblestones outside a crumbling keep. Its walls are pocked with moss, and ivy snakes through the cracks like green veins carrying the slow pulse of centuries. A banner, once crimson, now droops and shades closer to rust. The wind hums through the gaps, making the fabric flutter as though the castle itself breathes in sleep. Inside, the hall stretches wide, with a roof of blackened beams and a long table scarred by generations of knives and spilled ale. Wooden benches line it, each polished not by care but by the sheer weight of countless armored rears plopping down after a hard day of, well, mostly waiting for something to happen. Here lies our story. Not of famous knights you've heard of, the ones polished into shining saints by ballads, but of the quiet, forgotten ones. Men who wore armor dented from use, not just ceremony. Men whose names slipped from parchment, whose shields were buried under centuries of dust, whose greatest legacy may well be that someone remembered, just for a moment, that they once stood watch on a wall. A fact worth noting here: the medieval knight wasn't always the paragon of chivalry popular imagination makes him out to be. In the 12th century, knights were more like heavily armed land managers, responsible for protecting estates, collecting rents, and occasionally swinging a sword when things got out of hand. The chivalric code was a later invention, part moral aspiration, part medieval PR campaign. You might say the first knights were less gallant heroes and more muscle with horses. And here's a stranger tidbit. In some knightly orders, members were forbidden from eating certain foods, like roast peacock, because it was thought to encourage vanity. Historians still debate whether this was a serious rule or just someone's attempt at medieval dieting advice. The candle burns low, and your eyes begin to drift with the rhythm of the story. You hear the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, though no forge burns at this hour. You imagine the knight inside the hall, removing his helm, rubbing at his temples like any tired worker after a long shift. His armor is less glamorous up close, smelling faintly of rust, sweat, and the faint tang of last week's rain. This is where we begin among ordinary legends. Knights who kept their vows quietly, without expecting their names carved in stone. Men who, if they're remembered at all, are remembered only in shadows. And as you listen, half waking, half dreaming, you start to see them moving again. The hall's fire has dimmed into a soft orange glow, licking lazily at the logs, and you find yourself slipping into the rhythm of a night spent in the company of weary knights. The benches creak as they shift in their sleep. Some mutter in dreams, perhaps reliving old battles, or maybe just trying to remember if they left their boots outside in the rain again. You wander toward the far end of the hall, where a carved chair sits, not a throne, but close enough to one in a castle of this size. Its arms are etched with crude lions that look suspiciously more like hounds, and its seat cushion is lumpy in ways you'd rather not investigate. On the table before it lies a single goblet, half full of mead, abandoned by a knight who either grew too tired to finish or simply realized that mead tastes vaguely like someone dissolved honey into regret. Here you hear their stories, not the polished legends sung in courts, but the fireside versions, messy, human, and half-mumbled with the kind of honesty only exhaustion allows. One speaks of a lost tournament, where his horse stopped mid-run to graze, leaving him tumbling into the dirt while a crowd laughed. Another brags of slaying 2 bandits with one swing, though you suspect the number grows with each telling. A historical fact to keep you grounded. Tournaments in the early Middle Ages were not the elegant just you picture, with lances and flowers and ladies swooning. They were chaotic melees involving dozens of knights clashing across fields in what was essentially organized brawling. Some ended with a handshake, others with more funerals than feasts. No wonder the church kept trying to ban them, though, predictably, no one listened. And now for the odd tidbit of the night. Some knights swore oaths never to bathe during campaigns, claiming it built toughness. The smell, I assure you, built something else entirely. Historians still debate whether these vows were symbolic or just a convenient excuse for men who already disliked cold water. As you move along the hall, your hand brushes against the wall's rough stone. You feel its coolness, the slow exhale of centuries that have passed here unnoticed. Above, banners sag like tired eyelids, their faded emblems whispering of families whose names no longer echo beyond these walls. You catch sight of a knight sleeping upright in his chair, chin resting on his chest, helmet still on, as though too weary to finish the act of removing it. It would be comic, if not so relatable. You've probably fallen asleep mid-task too, though hopefully without 30 pounds of steel on your head. And here's the charm of forgotten nights. They were, in truth, not so different from you. They yawned, they worried about bills, only theirs came in the form of crop tithes and feudal dues. They argued about who snored loudest, and they longed, quietly, for something more than endless patrols and worn-out boots. You pause at the window. Beyond it lies the black countryside, fields stretching under the moon, forests sighing in the dark. Somewhere out there, peasants sleep beside their livestock, the real heartbeat of the land, while nights are but its loud armor. The silence settles over you, like a heavy but comforting blanket, and you find yourself breathing in sync with the quiet world outside. Perhaps that's what makes these stories worth telling. Not the grandiose victories, but the human weight of simply being here, keeping watch and waiting for dawn. Forgotten nights, dreaming in the corners of old halls, remind you that even legends, in the end, are just men trying to find a little peace before morning. And with that thought, the fire cracks softly, the candle burns lower, and your eyes begin to grow heavy. The night, after all, is long, and these tales are meant to last until sleep finds you. The night stretches on, and the hall feels even quieter now, as though the stones themselves have settled into slumber. You drift toward a side door, its wood swollen and cracked, iron hinges squealing softly as you press it open. The air that greets you is damp and earthy, the scent of moss and wet grass carrying in from the castle yard. The courtyard is dimly lit by the faintest silver glow of the moon, slipping through drifting clouds. Chickens, restless in their coop, murmur in clucks that sound oddly like gossip. A tired horse shifts in its stall, exhaling steam into the chill. You walk along the cobblestones, your feet crunching quietly, as if even the stones are careful not to wake the world. A small chapel stands tucked against the wall, its door left ajar. Inside, a candle sputters low, casting shadows that dance over painted saints whose expressions have peeled into something halfway between holy and slightly annoyed. On the pews you find a knight, not armored, not regal, but slouched forward, praying or sleeping. At this hour, it's hard to tell. A historical fact here: knights were deeply tied to faith. The very concept of knighthood was shaped by the church, especially during the Crusades. Oaths of loyalty, vows of protection for the poor, and service to God were central, at least in theory. In practice, knights often bent these rules to fit the needs of politics, war, or simply their own stomachs. And now for the strange tidbit. Some knightly orders were required to wear matching underwear, issued by their brotherhood. Supposedly this symbolized unity, but I suspect it was just one poor tailor's endless nightmare. Historians still debate whether this was an actual requirement or one of those delightful exaggerations whispered by their rivals. The chapel is cold, but peaceful. The knight shifts, sighs, and mutters under his breath. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps just a half-asleep complaint about sore knees. You step back outside, where the breeze carries a faint smell of wood smoke and wild thyme from the distant fields. The courtyard gate is chained but loose, and beyond it, the faint outline of the road winds into the dark countryside. You imagine the long marches knights made. Dust in their teeth, blisters in their boots, the kind of endless road that feels like walking in circles even when it isn't. And yet, those roads stitched together kingdoms, carried news, and bore legends from one hearth to another. You glance back at the keep. It looks softer in moonlight, less a fortress, more a tired giant trying to rest. You realize the same about these knights. They are not iron men, not marble statues of perfect courage, but weary travelers too, waiting for a dawn that feels impossibly far away. The chickens stir again, the horse stamps once, and the clouds drift across the moon like curtains drawn before sleep. You return inside through a narrow passage that smells of damp stone and faintly of onions. Someone clearly stored food here once, and the odor never left. The hall is quieter now, the fire almost nothing but glowing coals, the air warm but heavy, like a blanket you're not sure you can shrug off. Near the hearth, 3 knights have drawn close together, sharing a bench like weary children clumped after a long game. One snores, one mumbles, and the third just stares at the embers with eyes so heavy they may never open again. Their armor rests on the floor beside them, dented and scuffed, piled like a heap of shed burdens. Here is your fact of the night. Armor in the Middle Ages was not as impossibly heavy as people imagine. A full suit weighed about 45 to 55 pounds, distributed across the body. It's the equivalent of carrying around a modern hiking backpack. Uncomfortable, yes, but not impossible. The real struggle was not the weight but the heat, the limited vision, and the smell once you'd been stewing inside it for hours. And here's the odd tidbit. Knights sometimes wore padded undergarments called gambesons, stuffed with wool or horsehair, which soaked up sweat like a medieval sponge. Some became so foul over time that they could practically walk off by themselves. Historians still debate whether knights washed these regularly or simply chose denial as their method of laundry. The embers crack, glowing like tiny rubies scattered on ash. The knight staring into them finally blinks, mutters something about duty, in a voice so soft it might have been a dream, and tips over, joining the snoring chorus. You wander further, into a small alcove lined with shelves. Dusty manuscripts lie there. Some prayers, some records of land, some half-legible scrawls by clerks long forgotten. You trace your finger across the parchment, the ink faded but still clinging stubbornly, like the memory of those who once believed these records mattered. From somewhere outside, you hear the faint howl of a wolf, distant, lonely. The knights don't stir. They've heard it all before, and besides, the walls are strong enough, or at least they believe so. Faith, after all, is often more comforting than masonry. You lean back against the stone, breathing with the rhythm of the night. The coals pop once, sending up a lazy spark. The knights dream their forgotten dreams. The castle sleeps, and you feel yourself drawn further into the quiet hum of the past. The night deepens, but the stillness is never absolute. Castles breathe in their own way, through the creak of beams, the drip of hidden water, the shuffle of mice who treat this place as their ancestral inheritance. You follow the faint glow of another passage, and the air cools further, smelling faintly of iron and old hay. You emerge into the armory. Rows of spears lean in crooked angles, shields rest scuffed and battered against the wall, and swords lie on racks with edges dulled by use. It is less a glorious gallery and more a cluttered storage room, a reminder that legends are made out of tools, not treasures. A knight sits hunched on a stool here, polishing a helmet. His cloth moves slowly, more out of habit than purpose. You can tell by his eyes that he's not polishing at all. He's remembering. Perhaps a tournament, perhaps a friend who didn't ride back, or perhaps just a time when his knees didn't ache quite so much. Here's a fact to steady the story. Medieval tournaments were not just noble entertainment. They were brutal rehearsals for war. What began as chaotic melees later became more structured justs, with rules and banners. Victories could win a knight fame, fortune, or at least the admiration of someone peering nervously from the stands. And for the strange tidbit, some knights, before charging into justs, wore charms tucked into their armor. Bits of cloth, lockets of hair, even small carved bones. Historians still debate whether these were genuine talismans or simply excuses for why they lost. Oh, well, the charm must have slipped. The knight in the armory hums faintly, some half-remembered tune, slow as a lullaby. The stone walls catch the sound and turn it hollow, like a ghost singing along. You wander past him, brushing fingers over a shield scarred by long cracks. The marks are less battle scars and more diary entries, each telling a story too tedious or too personal to have made it into song. A torch on the wall flickers. Shadows of swords stretch long and thin, like tired men standing guard. The knight doesn't look up. He just keeps humming, cloth against metal, as though polishing the past itself. Leaving the armory, you slip down another hall where the air grows warmer, carrying the unmistakable smell of food long since eaten. The kitchen lies ahead, its door slightly open, its hearth still faintly glowing with embers. Inside, wooden tables are strewn with crumbs and bowls that look as though they were abandoned mid-thought. A half loaf of bread, already going stale, rests beneath a cloth. A jug of ale leans sideways, its cork missing, as though one knight had poured a drink and promptly fallen asleep before finishing it. You sit on a bench, running your hand across the grain of the wood, feeling the grooves carved by knives and elbows over years of use. The kitchen cat, every medieval kitchen had one, stares at you from atop a barrel. Its eyes are wide, its fur ragged, its tail twitching as though it remembers all the mice that failed to escape. Here's the historical fact for this stretch. Medieval diets for knights were surprisingly heavy on bread, cheese, and ale. Meat was reserved for wealthier occasions, and vegetables filled the pot when they had to. A knight's feast could look rich, but daily life was more porridge than roast swan. And the odd tidbit. Some castles brewed beer so weak it was safer than water, nicknamed small beer. Children drank it. Knights drank it. Basically, everyone spent their days very mildly tipsy, which might explain a few questionable medieval decisions. Historians still debate how widespread the practice was, though the surviving jokes about it suggest it was far from rare. The cat leaps down, tail brushing your leg like a careless blessing, and disappears through a crack in the wall. You imagine it prowling corridors unseen, guardian of crumbs and secrets. The kitchen's warmth soothes the chill from your bones. The crackle of the hearth is quiet, gentle. You close your eyes a moment, letting yourself picture the knights gathered here earlier. Laughter echoing, spoons clattering, stories exaggerated into legends by the bottom of a cup. Now it is empty, save for you, the shadows, and the faint scent of baked bread long vanished. The coals glow, red and steady, as though whispering you toward rest. The castle's heartbeat slows as you wander deeper into its quiet lungs. You pass down a corridor where the floor dips slightly, sloping toward a heavy wooden door. The hinges sigh when you push it open, and the smell of hay greets you before the sight does. You have arrived at the stables. Lanterns hang low, their flames swaying, painting gold halos on the straw-strewn floor. Horses shuffle in their stalls, tails swishing lazily, hooves thudding against wood in sleepy rhythm. One of them leans its great head toward you, breath steaming in the cold, nostrils wide enough to swallow a fist. You stroke its nose and it huffs warm air that smells faintly of grass, oats, and patience. Knights were nothing without their horses. A warhorse was worth as much as a knight's armor, sometimes more. They were trained not just to run but to charge, bite, and kick on command. They were companions, weapons, and status symbols all in one. Here's the odd tidbit. Some horses were given names so grand they sound more like rock bands than animals. Names like Thunder, Arrow, or even Glorious Steed of Morning. Historians still debate whether the horses cared, but the knights certainly did. The stable boy snores in the corner, slumped against a sack of oats, straw sticking to his tunic. You imagine his dreams are of galloping across fields or maybe just of not being trampled. His job is not heroic, but he is the one who keeps hoofs clean and saddles strong. Heroes, after all, are supported by armies of the unnoticed. Somewhere above, an owl hoots. The horses prick their ears, then settle again. You lean against the stable door, listening to the soft shifting of straw, the breath of living animals, the steady cadence of medieval life in its least dramatic, most tender form. The stables remind you of something the songs often forget. Knights did not ride out alone. They carried with them the echoes of animals, squires, cooks, and stable boys, each thread woven into the fabric of a legend. From the warmth of the stables, you follow another draft of cool air into the courtyard. The moon hangs pale and heavy, its light spilling silver across cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of boots and hooves. The courtyard feels larger at night. Its silence expands the space, so that even the small well at the center looks like a landmark of some forgotten map. You step closer, peering into its depths. The water glimmers faintly, a mirror to the stars. A knight leans against the well, helmet off, his hair sticking damp to his forehead. He dips a bucket slowly, lifts it, drinks, and lets the excess pour over his wrists. His sigh is the sound of centuries, relief, exhaustion, and the smallest sip of joy. Here's your historical fact for the evening. Medieval wells were often the heart of the castle. They determined survival in sieges, gave life to kitchens and breweries, and sometimes even doubled as places for whispered confessions. Without water, no castle stood for long. Now for the stranger tidbit. In some places, people believed wells had spirits, guardians who punished those who disrespected the water. Tossing a coin wasn't just superstition. It was a bribe to keep the spirit friendly. Historians still debate whether these tales were moral lessons or just very effective anti-littering campaigns. The knight wipes his mouth, rests his bucket, and mutters something you can't catch. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps a curse, or perhaps he's just talking to the water spirit. You smile at the thought. Wind swirls through the courtyard, carrying the smell of damp stone and distant pinewood smoke. Somewhere a shutter bangs gently against a wall. You wander slowly, dragging a hand across the rough stone edges, feeling history press itself into your fingertips. Above, the stars blink lazily. Some of them have burned for millions of years, but here, tonight, they look as though they've been hung just for the knights who forgot they'd ever be remembered. You follow the courtyard's edge until a shadowed archway beckons. Its stones are cool to the touch, carved centuries ago by hands long gone. You duck beneath it, stepping into a narrow stairwell that spirals downward, the air turning colder with each breath. The torchlight sputters, then steadies, as though reluctant to illuminate what lies ahead. At the bottom, you find yourself in the castle's armory. Rows of weapons line the walls, swords polished but scarred, shields painted with fading heraldry, spears stacked like bundles of wheat waiting for harvest. The room hums faintly with iron and oil, as if the metal itself is whispering about past battles and the hands that once gripped it. You reach for a sword. It is heavier than you expect, awkward, not the elegant blade of legends but a blunt reminder that fighting was less about dance and more about endurance. Knights did not twirl these like stage performers. They swung them with aching shoulders and blistered hands. Here's your major fact. Chainmail, contrary to romantic depictions, was not invincible. It protected against slashes but often failed against blunt force or a well-placed arrow. Many knights wore padded garments beneath, layering discomfort like an onion of itchy protection. Your odd tidbit. Some knights believed iron itself had magical properties, capable of warding off evil spirits. Historians still debate whether this belief was widespread or simply one of those rumors that medieval taverns were very good at inventing. The squires' voices echo faintly in memory. They would have sharpened blades here, boiled leather, polished helmets until they could catch a flicker of torchlight. The armory was less a gallery of glory and more a workshop of survival. You set the sword back and notice a dent in the wall where someone once missed a practice swing. Even legends had clumsy moments, though minstrels rarely sang about those. Imagine the ballad, Sir Geoffrey, Slayer of Walls. Doesn't quite inspire the same awe, does it? From the armory, you slip into a smaller adjoining chamber where the ceiling drops low, the air tinged with smoke and something faintly sweet. This is the kitchen, quiet now, but still alive with traces of the day's chaos. Cauldrons hang above the hearth, soot streaking the stones black. A loaf of bread cools on the table, uneven, with a crust so thick it could double as a shield in desperate times. A knife rests beside it, its blade dulled from years of chopping. Kitchens were the hidden engines of castles. Without them, knights would have marched on empty stomachs and fainted halfway into glory. Here's your historical fact. Medieval diets leaned heavily on bread, ale, and pottage, a kind of stew where everything edible was tossed together and boiled into submission. For your obscure tidbit, there are records of some medieval cooks adding ground eggshells into meals to make them more filling. Historians still debate whether this was culinary innovation or simply a very polite form of trickery. The silence here is soothing. You imagine the earlier bustle. Knives chopping onions, a spit turning slowly over the fire, someone arguing that the stew needed more salt while another swore it needed less. And in the corner, a cat would likely be waiting, sharp-eyed for any scraps. Tonight the hearth glows faintly, embers pulsing like the heartbeat of a sleeping dragon. The room smells faintly of herbs, maybe thyme, maybe rosemary. The shelves hold jars of dried leaves, bundles of garlic, and mysterious powders that might cure a fever or, equally, ruin a stew. You sit at the table, breaking off a piece of bread. It is dense, chewy, a little bitter, but strangely comforting. Knights may have chased glory, but this bread torn in silence was what truly kept them alive. And perhaps that is the forgotten truth of kitchens. They were not just places of sustenance but of survival, of community, and of whispered secrets carried over boiling pots. Imagine all the strategies of wars planned beside cauldrons. History may not credit the cooks, but every victory tasted faintly of their work. You leave the warmth of the kitchen, passing back into the corridor where the stone walls glisten faintly with condensation. The hallway curves upward, drawing you toward another life within the castle. The chapel. The door creaks as you push it open, and the smell of old incense wafts out like a ghost. Inside, the space is dim, lit only by narrow slits of moonlight slipping through high windows. The pews are wooden, plain, and slightly crooked, carved more for endurance than comfort. At the far end stands the altar, draped in a cloth embroidered with faint gold threads, worn thin from years of folded prayers. You walk quietly, as though disturbing the silence might wake someone. In a way, it does. The echoes of whispered chants, of Latin verses sung by monks whose voices linger here longer than their lives. Here's your historical fact. Every castle of note had its own chapel, however small, because faith was woven into the rhythm of medieval existence. Prayers preceded battles, consecrated marriages, marked births, and softened the harshness of death. For your curious tidbit, some chapels were built with tiny squints, little angled holes in the wall, so servants and lower status folk could peek at Mass without being fully present. Historians still debate whether this was an act of inclusion or exclusion cleverly disguised. The floor beneath your feet bears scratches from years of kneeling, grooves etched into stone by persistence. You run your fingers over one of the carvings, and it feels oddly human, like shaking hands across time with someone whose hopes were once as heavy as yours. And then you notice a detail minstrels never sing about. A cracked hymn book abandoned on a bench, pages stiff from water damage. You imagine some knight swearing under his breath, not at an enemy, but at the dampness that ruined his place in the Psalms. Glorious battles make for songs, moldy hymnals do not. The chapel leads to another passageway, narrower and more uneven, as if the stonemasons got distracted halfway through. At its end, you step into the castle's library, or what passes for one. Do not picture rows of polished oak shelves and grand chandeliers. Instead, think of a modest chamber, its shelves uneven and groaning under the weight of manuscripts bound in cracked leather. The air smells of dust, ink, and faintly of candle wax. A single wooden desk sits under the window, scarred by years of quills scratching across parchment. You run a hand along a book's spine. It is stiff, reluctant to open, but within it lies knowledge once so precious it could change lives. Manuscripts here may contain psalms, herbals, or records of land ownership. Less thrilling than tales of dragons, perhaps, but far more necessary for the machinery of daily life. Here's your historical fact. In the 12th and 13th centuries, monasteries and castle libraries often doubled as record offices. A lord's charter was worth more than his sword, for without it, his land could be lost in a heartbeat. For your odd tidbit, some medieval scribes doodled in the margins of manuscripts. Tiny rabbits jousting, knights fighting snails, or cats licking themselves mid-page. Historians still debate whether this was satire, boredom, or simply proof that even the Middle Ages had its share of distracted daydreamers. The quiet here feels thick, almost padded, as though the walls themselves are muffling the world. You sit at the desk, dipping an imaginary quill into an invisible inkwell, tracing words that have no meaning but soothed by their rhythm. Scribble, scratch, pause, like rain on a rooftop. And perhaps, in this room, the knights were remembered less as warriors and more as figures in ink. Every charter signed, every psalm copied, every doodle of a snail. These were the real legends etched in parchment, waiting quietly for someone to stumble upon them again. You leave the library with ink-stained fingers, real or imagined, and step into a wider stairwell spiraling upward. Each footstep echoes faintly, reminding you that stone was not built for silence, but for permanence. At the top, you emerge into the great hall once more, though now it feels changed. The fire has dwindled, embers glowing like sleepy eyes, and the shadows stretch longer, draped across carved beams. The hall is more than a dining room. It is the heartbeat of the castle, the place where deals were struck, guests entertained, disputes settled, and reputations carved in louder tones than ink could manage. Historical fact for you: medieval great halls often doubled as dormitories. At night, servants and retainers unrolled straw mats along the edges, sleeping in the same place where hours earlier they'd feasted or listened to music. Luxury meant not privacy, but maybe a slightly softer mat closer to the fire. For your unusual tidbit, some lords kept indoor pets, falcons perched on stands, or even small dogs wandering among the trestle tables. Imagine trying to eat stew while a hawk glares at you from across the room. Historians still debate whether these were displays of power or just eccentric household habits. You stand at the head table and look down the length of the hall. The benches seem to wait, empty but expectant, as though the ghosts of meals past still linger. The smell of roasted meat, the clatter of wooden bowls, the murmur of gossip in corners. And you think, legends of knights may be told in battlefields, but here in this smoky hall, reputations were shaped more by the strength of one's laughter, the generosity of shared bread, or the sharp wit of a story told after supper. Beyond the great hall, a smaller door leads to the solar, the private chamber of the lord and his family. Here, the air is warmer, softened by thick tapestries hung on walls to keep the chill at bay. A wooden chest sits in the corner, iron-bound and heavy, and a narrow bed with linen sheets looks surprisingly inviting compared to straw. You run your hand over the embroidered fabric draped on the walls. Scenes of saints, stylized vines, perhaps even crude attempts at mythical beasts. The colors are faded but still rich enough to remind you that cloth was once as valuable as coin. Here's your historical fact. The solar was where the family gathered in semi-privacy, away from the bustle of the great hall. It was here that children learned their letters, that accounts were tallied, and that quieter conversations could take place without a dozen retainers listening in. And your odd tidbit: some tapestries were used less for decoration and more for insulation. A drafty wall might be covered by fabric woven so densely it could almost serve as an extra layer of stone. Historians still debate whether the most elaborate scenes were for beauty, faith, or simply to brag about how many sheep you'd sheared that year. You sit on the edge of the bed, hearing faint creaks in the timbers above. Maybe it's just the castle breathing, or maybe it's the memory of a child's laughter, a woman's whispered prayer, or a knight quietly removing his boots after too much ale. In the soft glow of a single candle, the legends of forgotten knights shrink into something humbler. A family, huddled together against the cold, weaving warmth from cloth and company. The solar's candlelight fades behind you as you step into a narrower passage, one rarely walked by honored guests. The stones here are rougher, the air colder, and the echoes sharper, like whispers tucked into corners. You follow the sound of your own breath until the passage broadens into the chapel. It is a small space, humble compared to the grandeur of cathedrals, but no less solemn. Stone benches line the walls, and a wooden altar rests at the far end, crowned by a simple cross. Candles flicker in iron sconces, their flames swaying as if uneasy about their role in holding back the dark. Here's your fact. Most castles had chapels, not just for prayer but as an assertion of legitimacy. A knight or a lord could rule with sword and coin, but to build a chapel meant aligning yourself with divine order. To pray here was to confirm, out loud or silently, that your authority carried heaven's blessing, or at least its hopeful shadow. Your curious tidbit: some chapels kept relics, bits of cloth, bones, or even a feather believed to be from the wing of an angel. Whether they inspired faith or suspicion is another matter entirely. Historians still debate how many of these relics were genuine and how many were crafted by enterprising merchants who knew that pilgrims always carried coin. You kneel for a moment, not because you're pious but because the bench looks like the only seat available. The candlelight pools around you, and for a fleeting second, you sense that the forgotten knights who prayed here carried not just swords, but burdens. Doubt, fatigue, fear, all laid quietly before the altar in the hope that someone, somewhere, was listening. Leaving the chapel, you follow another set of stairs downward. Each step creaks faintly, and the air grows damp. Soon, you enter the undercroft, a vaulted chamber of stone that smells faintly of earth and salt. The walls sweat with moisture, and the shadows seem thicker here, as though reluctant to leave. This was storage space, practical and necessary. Barrels line the walls, filled with salted fish, ale or grain. Wooden racks hold tools, spare weapons, and rolls of cloth wrapped against mice. The air feels cooler here, a medieval refrigerator powered not by electricity, but by stone's patient embrace of the cold. Your historical fact. Castles often relied on undercrofts and cellars not just for food, but for survival. In winter, these spaces kept supplies safe. In times of siege, they became the thin line between endurance and starvation. And your obscure tidbit. In some places, salt was so valuable it was locked away like treasure. There are even records of salt being used as wages, a reminder that survival sometimes came in crystalline grains. Historians still debate whether the careful management of salt supplies made or broke certain households in lean years. You brush your fingers along a barrel, hearing the faint hollow thud inside. Was it full once, emptied long ago, or still holding secrets beneath its lid? Perhaps a knight once paced here nervously, waiting for news from above, listening for the distant clang of siege engines. Or maybe it was simpler. A farmer-turned-soldier, sneaking a sip of ale in the quiet shadows. The undercroft holds no grandeur, but its silence is rich with stories. And in that silence you realize, the forgotten knights may not have left their names carved into stone, but they left behind the spaces where survival itself was fought, quietly and stubbornly, in the dark. You leave the undercroft, climbing a narrow stair that winds upward like a spine. The air grows warmer again, scented faintly of rushes and smoke. At the top, you emerge into the great hall, a cavernous chamber that feels less like a room and more like a statement. High wooden beams stretch overhead, their dark ribs crossing like the bones of some enormous creature. Banners hang limp from the walls, faded and moth-nibbled, yet still defiant in color. At the hall's center stretches a long oak table, scarred with knife marks and rings from countless mugs. The benches around it bear the grooves of centuries of restless elbows and shifting armor. Here's your fact. The Great Hall was the heartbeat of medieval life, more than just a dining space. It was a courtroom, a stage for hospitality, and sometimes even a dormitory for servants. If you lived here, you probably ate, argued, slept, and occasionally snored in the same place. Your obscure tidbit. Some halls kept trained dogs, not as guards but as living napkins. They padded along the benches during meals, ready to lick greasy fingers clean. Convenient? Yes. Sanitary? Let's call it medieval innovation. Historians still debate whether such practices were widespread or exaggerated by chroniclers who enjoyed poking fun at noble households. You step toward the fire pit at the center, its coals glowing faintly as though even the embers refuse to leave. Shadows dance up the walls, making the faded banners shiver. Imagine the laughter, the boasts, the whispered plots that once filled this chamber. A night, forgotten by history, once leaned here with a mug of ale, telling stories that lived for an evening before dissolving into smoke. And you, standing alone in the quiet, find yourself smiling at the thought that maybe, just maybe, the The forgotten knight had jokes that never survived the chroniclers, but which left his companions gasping with laughter over the fire. At the far end of the hall, a narrow wooden door creaks open into another chamber, the solar. Unlike the grand hall's echoing vastness, this room feels intimate, even cozy. The floor is scattered with woven mats, the air carrying the faint smell of beeswax from the stubby candles. A bed rests beneath an embroidered canopy, the fabric faded but still proud in its reds and golds. A small table stands nearby, cluttered with parchments, a wooden cup, and what looks like a game board. Its pebbles frozen mid-play as though abandoned when someone was called away suddenly, centuries ago. Here's your fact. The solar was the private space of the Lord's family, often perched above the hall so warmth from the fire below could seep upward. It was one of the few places where life slowed, away from the watchful eyes of servants and soldiers. Your quirky tidbit. Medieval game boards weren't only for chess. Some families favored Nine Men's Morris, a game of strategy that could stretch on for hours. One monk complained in writing that his brothers played it so obsessively, they sometimes forgot prayer time. Historians still debate whether the game was frowned upon as a distraction or quietly tolerated as mental exercise. You picture the knights off duty here. Helmets unbuckled, boots unlaced, shoulders softened from battle posture. Perhaps one of them stared at that abandoned board, planning his next move, or just enjoying the rare peace of being indoors, warm, and alive. A draft stirs the canopy overhead, and for a moment, the room feels as though it breathes with you. The solar is less about splendor, more about humanity. A reminder that even knights, armored and stern in chronicles, once dozed off mid-game, drooled on the mats, and forgot their troubles, if only for a night. You linger in the solar a moment longer, then step out onto a narrow stone walkway. The air cools your face instantly, fresh with the scent of moss and night. Before you stretches the castle wall, winding along the edge of the cliff like a stone ribbon. From here you can see the fields below, a patchwork of tilled earth and meadows, silent beneath the weight of starlight. A small guard tower looms nearby, its doorway half collapsed but still inviting. You duck inside. The spiral stair within feels more like a corkscrew drilled into stone than something built by human hands. Up you climb, the walls closing tight around you until, at last, you emerge on the battlements. Here's your fact. Medieval castles often stationed a few men atop these walls at all hours, not for constant battle, but simply to keep an eye on the quiet horizon. Life on the wall was more boredom than glory. Your quirky tidbit. Some guards whittled small wooden charms during their shift, leaving them tucked between the stones for luck. A handful of these carvings have actually been discovered in ruins. Tiny hearts, crude crosses, even one that looks suspiciously like a very wobbly horse. Historians still debate whether these were private devotions or just board doodles in 3 dimensions. From this high vantage, you sense the forgotten knights more vividly. Picture one leaning against the parapet, staring at the same stars you see now, wondering if his name would mean anything beyond tomorrow's watch. He likely didn't know that history tends to be picky. It remembers kings and battles, but forgets the man who carved a lopsided horse for luck. You lean on the stone yourself and the stillness presses in. If you nod off here, no one will blame you. After all, even knights did it. Helmet tipped forward, snoring softly as the night carried on without them. The tower behind you sighs as though exhaling old breath, and you descend again, step by slow step. At the base of the wall, you find a wooden gate slightly ajar, its hinges rusted but functional. Pushing through, you arrive in a small orchard tucked inside the outer bailey. Here, the air feels different, sweeter. Apple trees bend beneath their own weight, branches gnarled and stubborn. The ground is littered with fallen fruit, some half-eaten by birds, others shining pale under the moon. Here's your fact. Orchards were common within castle grounds, not only for food but also for medicine. Apples were pressed into cider, boiled into syrups, and sometimes mashed into poultices. Your quirky tidbit. Medieval texts describe a curious belief that eating an apple before dawn made you immune to lightning strikes. A charming thought, though one imagines a knight sprinting into a thunderstorm while chewing furiously on fruit. Historians still debate whether this was sincerely believed or recorded with a wink of satire. You wander beneath the trees, brushing your fingertips along the bark. A cool breeze nudges through the branches, carrying the faintest sweetness. Somewhere in the dark, you hear the shuffle of a small creature. Perhaps a hedgehog, perhaps your imagination. And here's the quiet truth. Knights weren't only creatures of iron and oaths. They were also creatures of orchards and cider, of stolen fruit and laughter in the twilight. Forgotten names once sat on this very grass, biting into apples that crunched loudly enough to scare off the night birds. You take a breath, slow and deliberate, and the orchard holds it with you. For just a moment, the world shrinks to you, the trees, and the soft promise that life, in its simplest form, has always been this sweet. The orchard lingers behind you, its sweetness still clinging faintly to your senses. You follow a narrow dirt path that winds toward the far edge of the bailey. The ground crunches underfoot, gravel, loose stones, and the occasional crunch of a forgotten nut shell. The night air thickens, carrying with it the musk of damp earth and something else, the unmistakable hush of water. Sure enough, the path opens onto a small pond, round and perfect, like a mirror dropped from the heavens. Its surface barely stirs, reflecting the stars above with eerie precision. You crouch down, fingertips brushing the cool surface, and ripples bend the sky until constellations wobble and dance. Here's your fact. Many medieval castles had ponds stocked with fish, pike, carp, or eels as a reliable food supply, especially during fasting days when meat was off limits. And here's your quirky tidbit. There are scattered records of knights naming their favorite fish, feeding them scraps of bread, and treating them almost like mascots. One chronicler even claimed a knight in Burgundy held a small funeral for his companion carp. Historians still debate whether this was sincere grief or simply a scribe's creative flourish. Imagine it. A forgotten knight kneeling at this same pond, whispering secrets to a fish who would never gossip. You almost hear the chuckle in his voice as he flicks a crumb onto the water. The pond is quiet tonight, but not empty. Small insects dance above the surface, frogs murmur faintly in the reeds, and the occasional plop marks some unseen swimmer. You sit back on the grass, arms folded behind your head, and the whole pond feels like a lullaby carved in liquid. A thought creeps in. If knights could name their fish, maybe you can name this pond. Something sleepy, like Mirror of Dreams, or something sillier like Sir Bubbles. Either way, the water doesn't mind. Leaving the pond, you drift toward the farthest corner of the grounds, where the outer walls blur into the dark countryside. Here, a half-forgotten chapel crouches among the weeds. Its roof has collapsed in places, and ivy has claimed much of the stone, but the bell tower still leans stubbornly upward, as though reaching for one last prayer. You push the door open. The wood groans in complaint but relents. Inside, moonlight filters through broken rafters, scattering pale shapes across the dusty floor. Wooden benches stand in crooked rows, and at the far end, a weathered altar waits patiently. Here's your fact. Castle chapels often doubled as community spaces. They weren't just for solemn prayers but also for oaths of loyalty, important meetings, and even the occasional wedding. Here's your quirky tidbit. In one English chapel, graffiti from the 14th century was discovered etched into the stone walls. Among crosses and prayers, someone had drawn what looked suspiciously like a chicken with a crown. Historians still debate whether this was meant as satire, a doodle, or some odd symbolic joke. The forgotten knights once knelt here, armor clattering against stone as they mumbled words they half believed. Some prayed sincerely, others out of duty, and a few, perhaps, were just trying not to doze off mid-sermon. You settle into a pew yourself. The wood is splintered but forgiving. Overhead, a patch of sky peeks through the broken roof, stars twinkling like tiny stained glass. The quiet of the chapel presses in. Not heavy, but soft, like a blanket you didn't realize you needed. And maybe, for the first time tonight, you sense it. The weight of centuries is not a burden, but a pillow. The prayers, the doodles, the crown-wearing chicken. All of it blends into the same calm hum of humanity. You lean back, close your eyes, and let the chapel walls breathe around you. You leave the chapel behind, its crown-wearing chicken and starry roof tucked safely in memory, and follow a narrow stair spiraling down into the earth. The air grows cool, the torchlight faintly licking stone walls carved with uneven grooves. Soon you find yourself in the undercroft, a cellar once meant for storage, but now a chamber of quiet echoes. The vaulted ceiling curves low, supported by chunky pillars that sprout like stone trees. Barrels rest along the walls, some split open, others still sealed, smelling faintly of old ale and salted fish. Your footsteps crunch over straw, scattering mice who squeak in sleepy protest. Here's your fact. Castle cellars often doubled as treasure vaults and archives. Not the shiny kind of treasure, more like sacks of grain, crates of apples, or parchment stuffed with dull tax records. But in their own way, these were riches that kept the castle alive. Here's your quirky tidbit. In one 12th century record, a clerk described a rat infestation so severe that a castle's accounts were eaten, literally. Historians still debate whether this was an exaggeration to cover for lost funds or a tragic case of medieval vermin with gourmet taste. You run your fingers along the rough barrels and think about forgotten knights storing their armor down here after long campaigns. Imagine one of them, exhausted, tossing his dented shield into a corner and muttering, "I'll clean it tomorrow." Spoiler, he never did. The air smells of stone and slumber. You sit on a barrel, shoulders sinking against the cool pillar. The cellar hums like a lullaby written in stone. If the knights dreamed here, you suspect their dreams were filled not with glory, but with cheese wheels rolling endlessly across a field. Up from the cellar, you climb into night again. The moon is higher now, painting silver across the battlements. The courtyard is nearly empty, shadows long and soft. But as you walk toward the outer gate, you notice something strange. A cluster of carved stones arranged in a circle, tucked into the farthest corner of the yard. You wander closer. The stones are smooth, etched with faint symbols, spirals, crude faces, odd marks that could be letters, or doodles left by very bored guards. At the center, a single upright stone leans precariously, like a knight who stayed too long at the tavern. Here's your fact. Many castles incorporated earlier sacred sites into their grounds. Builders didn't always demolish the old stone circles or shrines. Sometimes they built around them, layering new beliefs atop old ones. Here's your quirky tidbit. One chronicler in Wales claimed a circle of stones inside a castle was used by guards for night games, which involved balancing bread loaves on their helmets. Historians still debate if this was an actual pastime or just a medieval version of gossip gone wild. You sit on one of the stones and trace a spiral with your fingertip. The night air hums with a kind of timelessness here, as though the stones are whispering, "We were here before knights, and will be here after." The idea is oddly comforting, like borrowing someone else's blanket across centuries. Above, the stars tilt lazily across the sky. The symbols, the spirals, the leaning night stone. Everything here seems to sag in the same sleepy rhythm. And you, too, sag into it, shoulders sinking as though gravity itself has grown drowsy. You chuckle softly at the thought of nights trying to balance bread loaves here under the moon. The stones don't mind the laughter. They've heard worse. You walk slowly toward the outer gate. The towers loom above you, their battlements drowsy silhouettes against the starlit sky. The air is cooler now, scented faintly with damp earth and wood smoke drifting from dying hearths. Each stone beneath your feet feels heavier, like the castle itself is exhaling, ready for sleep. At the gatehouse, a wooden door creaks open with the weary sigh of iron hinges. You step through and find yourself on the quiet road beyond. The fields stretch into the dark, pastures silvered by moonlight, dotted with the dark shapes of grazing sheep too stubborn to rest. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hoots, the perfect medieval lullaby note. Here's your fact. Most medieval knights ended their lives not in battle, but in relative quiet, managing estates, attending court, or even joining monasteries. The legends remember their swords, but their final chapters often looked more like long evenings by the fire. Here's your quirky tidbit. One knight in France retired to a vineyard, where he wrote poetry about grapes. Historians still debate whether his verses were intentionally humorous or simply very bad. Either way, his ode to the stubborn vine survives. A gentle reminder that not all heroes chose dragons as their last opponents. The castle behind you fades into the dark. Its towers, its chapels, its chickens and crowns, each dissolves into shadow. But in memory, they linger, a quilt of stone and story, stitched into the fabric of your night. You keep walking, the road soft beneath your feet. The stars shimmer above like old coins scattered across velvet. Somewhere between each step, you feel the legends settle around you. Not sharp, not heavy, but like a blanket tucked by unseen hands. And now, slowly, gently, we fade out, so breathe in deeply. Let the air of the medieval night fill your chest, cool, still, and timeless. Exhale and let it drift away, carrying with it the clatter of armor, the creak of gates, the whispers of chapels and cellars. The road ahead is long, but there is no need to walk further tonight. Each step you've taken through the castle and its stories has been enough. The knights you met, the strange tidbits, the sleepy stones, they all rest now, and so can you. Imagine the castle shrinking into a tiny glow behind you, like a lantern slowly dimming on the horizon. The sky grows wider, darker, softer, until it feels as though the whole world is wrapped in deep blue cloth. The stars drift lazily, patient and unhurried. You too can be patient now. You too can let go of the pace of the day. Perhaps you remember the cobbled street you walked earlier, or the kitchen's quiet fire, or the absurd chicken with its crown. All of them fold gently into dream. None of them ask anything from you now. The night is calm. The air is still. And you, resting here, are part of that stillness. Let your breath slow. Let your shoulders ease. Let the road, the castle, the nights, and the stories carry you softly into rest. Good night, dreamer. May your sleep be deep, and may your dreams be as gentle as the forgotten legends we've wandered through together.